Twin paradox. Imagine you have a twin. Both of you are exactly the same. Same age, same height, same personality. One day, you both decide to conduct an experiment. One twin stays on Earth, while the other climbs aboard a spaceship and travels through space at a speed close to the speed of light. After some time, the twin in the spaceship turns around and returns to Earth. When the two twins meet again, something unexpected happens. The twin who stayed on Earth has aged more than the twin who traveled in space. Wait, how is this possible? They started at the same age, so how can one twin be older than the other after the same period of time? This is the twin paradox, a famous thought experiment based on Einstein's theory of relativity. According to the theory, time is relative, meaning that it moves at different rates depending on how fast you are traveling. The twin who stays on Earth experiences time at a normal pace, but the twin who travels close to the speed of light on the spaceship experiences time more slowly. This phenomenon is known as time dilation, and it happens because as you approach the speed of light, time itself slows down for the person traveling at that speed relative to those who are stationary. In the twin paradox, the twin traveling in the spaceship experiences less passage of time than the twin on Earth. So when the traveling twin returns, they've aged less, even though both started at the same time. Now, you might be thinking, how is this fair? It seems as though there's a contradiction. The traveling twin is moving, and according to the idea of relative motion, shouldn't both twins see the other as moving and therefore aging slower? The key here is that the two twins are not in the same reference frame. The twin in the spaceship is accelerating and changing frames of reference when turning around to return to Earth. So the situation isn't symmetrical. Special relativity tells us that only the twin in motion, the spaceship twin, experiences the effects of time dilation due to the high speed of travel. This means the twin who stays on Earth remains in the same reference frame and experiences a normal flow of time. This paradox doesn't actually have any paradoxical consequences. It's a real and measurable effect that's been observed in experiments with atomic clocks and particles moving at high speeds. For example, particles called muons, which decay very quickly, have been shown to last longer when moving at high speeds because time is dilated for them. The twin paradox also forces us to confront how we think about time itself. We typically think of time as something absolute, the same for everyone, everywhere. But Einstein's theory shows that time is fluid and it can stretch and compress depending on how fast you are moving. So, what's the deeper lesson of the twin paradox? First, it shows us that our understanding of time isn't as simple as we might think. It's not a constant flow for everyone. It changes depending on how fast you're moving. But it also teaches us something about perspective. What we see as reality is often influenced by how we observe it. The twin paradox challenges our everyday intuitions about time, space, and the universe itself. It invites us to see time as a dynamic experience, one that is far more complex than we originally thought. It reminds us that in the world of relativity, time can be stretched or compressed and experienced differently depending on how fast we move through space. Next time you find yourself questioning how time works in your life, remember the twin paradox. It's a reminder that time is not just a constant, but part of a larger shifting fabric of the universe that's influenced by the very way we move through it.
Paradox of choice. Imagine walking into an ice cream shop with 50 flavors to choose from. Initially, you feel excited by the variety, but as you stand there, the options begin to overwhelm you. Should you go with chocolate or try something new? What if you regret your decision later? What should have been a simple, enjoyable choice becomes an overwhelming mental exercise. This is the paradox of choice, a psychological phenomenon that shows how more choices can lead to less happiness, not more. Popularized by psychologist Barry Schwartz in his book, The Paradox of Choice: Why More is Less, this paradox reveals a counterintuitive truth. Having more options can actually increase anxiety, dissatisfaction, and even regret. While we often assume that more choices equal greater freedom, research shows that the opposite can happen. At first glance, more choices seem like a good thing. After all, shouldn't the more options we have, the better our decisions will be? But the paradox lies in how our brains process abundance. When faced with too many choices, we become paralyzed by the possibilities. The more choices we have, the more we worry about the what-ifs, the options we didn't choose, leading to heightened fear of missing out and post-decision regret. Let's break this down. Imagine you're shopping for shoes. If there are only 5 pairs to choose from, the decision-making process is relatively simple. You weigh the pros and cons and make a choice quickly. But what if there are 100 pairs of shoes? Suddenly, the decision becomes more complex. You start second-guessing yourself, wondering if another pair would have been better. The increased variety doesn't make the decision-making process easier, it makes it harder. This effect is compounded by something psychologists call opportunity cost. Every choice we make means foregoing other options. When there are fewer choices, this cost feels small. But when there are dozens or hundreds of possibilities, the cost of what we didn't choose feels enormous. We become hyper-aware of the alternatives we gave up, making it harder to enjoy the choice we did make. The paradox of choice doesn't just apply to shopping or choosing what to eat. It affects many areas of life. When it comes to career decisions, relationships, and even self-identity, we often face an overwhelming array of options. The rise of social media amplifies this effect, where we constantly compare ourselves to others and feel pressured to make decisions based on what everyone else is doing. We begin to wonder, what if I'm missing out on something better? Studies show that the more choices we have, the less satisfied we tend to feel with our lives overall. The paradox goes beyond material choices into our deeper sense of self-worth and fulfillment. When we have too many choices, we also experience stress. The decision-making process becomes a source of anxiety. We worry about making the wrong choice. The end result? Paralysis by analysis. We become so overwhelmed by the possibilities that we end up making no decision at all. Or we make a decision and feel unfulfilled afterward. So how can we navigate the paradox of choice? The first step is to embrace simplicity. Instead of constantly seeking the perfect option, we can learn to settle for good enough. The concept of satisficing, introduced by psychologist Herbert Simon, suggests that rather than searching for the absolute best option, we should look for a solution that meets our needs adequately. When we adopt a satisficing mindset, we make decisions more quickly and with less stress, often finding ourselves more satisfied with the result. Another approach is to limit our options. When we feel overwhelmed by too many choices, one strategy is to restrict the number of options we consider. For instance, when choosing a movie to watch, instead of scrolling endlessly through thousands of options, we could limit ourselves to a smaller set, say only those within a particular genre or rating. By reducing the options, we reduce the stress of choosing and increase the likelihood of making a decision that satisfies us. Finally, focus on the process rather than the outcome. Many of us become consumed with the idea of making the perfect decision. But the truth is, most decisions we make are not life-altering. A meal, a movie, a pair of shoes. These are not the types of decisions that will significantly impact our long-term happiness. By shifting our focus away from the outcome and embracing the act of choosing itself, we reduce the pressure to make perfect decisions. The paradox of choice is a reminder that freedom doesn't always come from having an endless array of options. Sometimes it's the freedom to let go of the need for perfection and embrace what works best in the moment. We don't need 50 flavors of ice cream or hundreds of movie choices. Sometimes a smaller set of manageable options can feel just right. In the end, the paradox of choice isn't about limiting your options. It's about understanding that having fewer choices can sometimes lead to greater freedom. By recognizing the paradox, we can start making decisions that are more aligned with our values and less influenced by the overwhelming weight of endless options. In a world filled with choices, it's the art of simplifying that can bring us the greatest peace of mind.
Friendship paradox. Imagine walking into a room filled with people you know. You scan the crowd and notice that many of them are talking to others, laughing, and sharing experiences. You smile, feeling like you know quite a few people. But as you observe, a strange realization dawns upon you. Your friends seem to have more friends than you do. This isn't just an odd thought, it's a mathematical paradox that reflects a deeper, often uncomfortable truth about our social networks. Welcome to the friendship paradox. It's not just a quirky observation about relationships. It's a powerful idea that helps us understand how social circles work, how influence spreads, and how we perceive ourselves in comparison to others. At first, it seems counterintuitive. If you have a group of friends, shouldn't they all be in roughly the same boat? But here's the twist. The people you know who have more connections than you do are far more likely to be your friends. In a large social network, the few who are highly connected, your popular friends, act as social hubs. These individuals are more likely to befriend others, and thus they create a ripple effect. The result? The average friend has more friends than you do, even though you are equally part of the same social web. In mathematical terms, this paradox emerges because of how probability works in networks. People with many connections, like social butterflies or influencers, are statistically more likely to be friends with everyone in your network. This doesn't just make them more connected, it skews the average number of friends each person has, creating the illusion that your circle is smaller than it really is. The friendship paradox is not merely about numbers, it's about how our perceptions distort reality. The social networks we inhabit often feel like they are designed to make us feel lesser. Social media amplifies this perception as we scroll through feeds filled with highlights from our most connected friends, vacations, promotions, and perfect relationships. We see their successes, their popularity, and we compare them to our own lives, which, by comparison, seem quieter, less extraordinary. But what if this paradox is more than just a reflection of social comparisons? What if it's a mirror showing us how social influence operates? The paradox reflects how networks function at a structural level. The more connected someone is, the more they will influence the average. But it also teaches us something deeper about self-perception. Just because your friends seem to have a bigger network doesn't diminish the value of your own relationships. So what is the real takeaway here? The friendship paradox isn't just about feeling left out or comparing ourselves to others. It's a lesson in understanding networks, both online and offline. It's a reminder that social capital is not measured by the number of connections you have, but by the quality and depth of those connections. At its core, this paradox shows us that the truth of our social lives doesn't always match the surface-level perceptions. The real value of relationships lies not in the sheer number of friends, but in the meaningful connections we cultivate. It's a powerful reminder that the world is filled with highly connected people. The most important friendships are often the ones that make us feel truly seen. If you ever find yourself comparing your social life to others, remember the friendship paradox. Recognize that the social web is designed to look different from the inside. The more you understand it, the more you can appreciate the network you've built, whether large or small, and find contentment in the quality of your connections. After all, in a world filled with digital noise, real friendships are the ones that truly matter. Value paradox. Imagine standing in the middle of a desert, a vast expanse of sand stretching endlessly in all directions. In front of you sits a single bottle of water, its cool liquid shimmering under the harsh sun. Now, think about another item, a diamond, which despite its beauty and allure, serves little practical purpose in comparison to the water. Yet in the marketplace, the diamond fetches a price that far exceeds the water's worth. Water, essential for life, is often sold cheaply, while diamonds, which could be replaced with far less, command astronomical prices. Why is this? This is the heart of the value paradox, also known as the diamond water paradox, first raised by the philosopher Adam Smith. It challenges our understanding of value, utility, and the economics of perception. On the surface, the answer seems clear. Water is essential for survival, while diamonds are purely ornamental. However, the economic reality does not match this intuition. Water is essential for life, yet it often costs only a fraction of what we're willing to pay for non-essential luxuries like diamonds. Why? It seems absurd that the thing we need most is often the cheapest, while something we don't need at all costs so much. The paradox raises fundamental questions about how we assign value to things and how market forces shape our perceptions of what is valuable. To begin untangling this paradox, we must first distinguish between utility value and exchange value. Utility value refers to something's ability to satisfy a need. Water has enormous utility value because without it, life would not be possible. It is indispensable to human survival. On the other hand, diamonds have very little utility value. One could live an entire life without ever needing a diamond. But exchange value, the price we are willing to pay for something in the market, is often driven by scarcity, perception, and demand rather than need. Marginal utility, a concept from economics, helps explain why diamonds are so expensive. Marginal utility refers to the additional satisfaction or benefit gained from consuming one more unit of something. When you are stranded in a desert, the marginal utility of a single bottle of water is priceless. It could save your life. But when you are at home with easy access to clean water, that same bottle of water has little added value. The supply of water far exceeds the demand in most developed parts of the world, so its marginal utility decreases dramatically. Diamonds, in contrast, are scarce. They are not easy to obtain and take considerable effort and resources to mine and refine. A single diamond may not have high utility, but because of its scarcity, it holds a high marginal utility to those who desire it. This scarcity drives demand, thus inflating its price in the market. In this sense, scarcity, not utility, plays a central role in determining how valuable something is in an exchange economy. The value paradox also shines a light on the psychology of value. It challenges us to think critically about how much of value is perceived rather than intrinsic. Diamonds are valuable not because of their functional purpose, but because society has agreed they are valuable. The cultural and social significance attached to diamonds, whether as symbols of wealth, beauty, or love, inflates their exchange value, making them far more expensive than something as essential as water. Water, by contrast, often has no such cultural or social cachet attached to it, which keeps its exchange value low despite its immense utility. This paradox is not only an intellectual puzzle, but it also has real-world implications. The idea that necessities are cheap while luxuries are expensive underpins many aspects of our daily lives. It highlights how market forces can distort perceptions of value. Take, for example, healthcare and education.
Despite being fundamental to a functioning society, access to these essential services is often far less equitable than luxury goods. In some countries, healthcare might be expensive even though it's a basic human need, whereas high-end consumer goods like designer handbags or the latest smartphones are easily accessible. Economists have explained that value is subjective and context-dependent. It varies from person to person and across different economic, social, and geographical contexts. In countries with abundant natural resources like water, its value is often less recognized than in places where access to clean water is limited. On the other hand, in a place where diamonds are rare, their value may seem reasonable. However, this highlights a key issue. Value is shaped by a combination of utility, scarcity, and social perception, not merely the importance of the item itself. The value paradox also forces us to confront our social values. Why in many societies do we place so much value on luxury, rarity, and appearance? Why are status symbols like diamonds so much more prized than life-sustaining resources? In many ways, this paradox reflects the culture of consumerism that has become central to modern societies, where material wealth often takes precedence over the fundamental needs of the population. Philosophically, the paradox urges us to reconsider our own ideas about wealth and value. The idea that something should be valued simply because it is rare or attractive speaks to the human tendency to place value on the superficial. The value paradox invites us to look at the way we prioritize needs and ask ourselves whether our systems of value are rational or arbitrary. So what can we learn from the value paradox? First, we see that value is not inherent in the object itself, but is shaped by scarcity, social perceptions, and market dynamics. Second, it forces us to think about the moral and ethical implications of how we assign value in society. Is it right that something so essential to life can be undervalued, while something so non-essential is so highly prized? Finally, the paradox invites us to question our assumptions about wealth and value. It challenges us to rethink how we, as a society, measure worth, whether we should prioritize utility over status or vice versa.
Imagine someone stands in front of you and says, "This statement is false." At first glance, this might seem like a simple statement, but as you think about it, the paradox begins to unfold. Let's break it down. If the statement, "This statement is false," is true, then the statement itself must be false as it claims. But if it's false, that means the statement is actually true, creating a cycle of contradiction. On the other hand, if the statement is false, then what it says must be true, that the statement is false, but that brings us back to the original problem. It's both true and false at the same time, and this endless loop is exactly what makes this a paradox. This is the liar paradox, one of the most famous and perplexing paradoxes in logic and philosophy. It is a self-referential paradox, a statement that refers to itself in a way that leads to a logical contradiction. The paradox questions the very foundations of truth, falsehood, and language itself. So, how do we resolve this paradox? The truth is, we can't. The liar paradox shows us the limits of formal logic. If we accept the statement as both true and false at the same time, our system of reasoning breaks down. It forces us to confront the idea that truth and falsehood aren't always as simple as we think. Sometimes, self-referential statements like the liar paradox can't be categorized as simply true or false. They exist in a gray area, where logic as we know it no longer holds. This paradox also introduces important questions about language. It challenges our definitions of what it means for something to be true or false. If a statement can be true and false at the same time, it raises the issue of meaning. How can we be sure of anything when language itself contains contradictions? The liar paradox has fascinated philosophers, mathematicians, and logicians for centuries. It is a prime example of self-referential problems, which occur when a statement refers to itself and creates a logical loop. This paradox is the basis for a wide range of discussions in philosophical logic and has influenced modern mathematics and computational theory as well. In computer science, for example, self-referential paradoxes like this one have real-world implications in areas such as programming, database queries, and recursive functions. These kinds of paradoxes show us the limits of formal systems that are supposed to define what is true or false. One way to try to deal with paradoxes like the liar paradox is to modify the systems in which we operate. Some logicians have proposed non-classical logic systems that allow for statements to be neither true nor false, but in a state of indeterminacy. Others have suggested that self-referential statements should be avoided altogether to preserve the consistency of logic systems. But perhaps the most important lesson of the liar paradox is that not everything can be neatly resolved through logic. In real life, we encounter contradictions, ambiguities, and gray areas that can't always be explained with clear-cut answers. The paradox teaches us the limitations of our reasoning systems and encourages us to think more critically about language, truth, and meaning. So, the next time you come across a situation that feels like a logical loop, remember the liar paradox. It's a reminder that some things, no matter how much we try to analyze them, don't have easy answers, and that's okay. The paradox teaches us to embrace the mystery, the ambiguity, and the complexity of the world, and to recognize that logic alone can't always explain everything.
Grandfather paradox. Imagine you've just built the world's most advanced time machine, and the thrill of time travel is finally within your grasp. Without a second thought, you step into the machine, set the dial to the past, and travel back to a time long before you were born. Your mission is clear. Meet your grandfather when he was a young man. You arrive at your destination and everything looks perfect, but then something unexpected happens. While you're there, you make a huge mistake. You accidentally prevent your grandfather from meeting your grandmother. Without this encounter, your parents never exist, and by extension, neither do you. Wait a minute. If you don't exist, how could you have traveled back in time in the first place to stop your grandfather and grandmother from meeting? If you never existed, you couldn't have made the trip to the past to change the course of events, which means your grandfather and grandmother would have met after all. But if that happens, you do exist, and your actions in the past should still hold true. Welcome to the grandfather paradox, one of the most perplexing paradoxes in time travel theory. It exposes a deep contradiction in the idea of changing the past. Your actions in the past cause the very thing that would make your actions impossible. Here's the paradox in its simplest form. If you travel back in time and change events that lead to your own non-existence, then how can you exist to make those changes in the first place? If you never existed, you couldn't have made the trip to the past to change the course of events, which means your grandfather and grandmother would have met after all. But if that happens, you do exist, and your actions in the past should still hold true. This paradox forces us to question cause and effect, especially when time travel is involved. In normal circumstances, cause precedes effect. An event happens, which leads to another event. But in the grandfather paradox, the cause and effect seem to be intertwined in a loop that has no clear starting point. You can't change the past without undoing the very reason you traveled back in time. The paradox also brings up the issue of determinism and free will. If you can change the past, does that mean the future isn't set? If it's not set, then can you really make choices that will alter history? Or is your future fate already sealed in a timeline that prevents paradoxes like this from happening? Are time travel actions inherently predetermined, or do they open up an infinite number of timelines? Now, what about solutions? The grandfather paradox has puzzled philosophers and physicists for years. One popular theory is that the timeline is self-correcting. In this view,
Any changes you make to the past, like preventing your grandparents from meeting, would somehow correct themselves to maintain the continuity of time. In this case, even if you tried to change the past, the universe would fix itself in a way that prevents paradoxes from arising. Another possible explanation comes from the idea of parallel universes. According to this theory, when you travel back and change the past, you don't alter your own timeline. Instead, you create a new parallel timeline where the changes happen. This would mean that in your original timeline, you still existed and never interfered with your grandparents' meeting. In this model, multiple timelines exist, and each time you travel back, you create new branches in reality. A more radical approach to the grandfather paradox suggests that time travel itself might be impossible, or that there are inherent limits to changing the past. This theory asserts that certain events in history, like the meeting of your grandparents, are fixed points in time that can't be altered. No matter how we approach the paradox, it highlights the complexities of time travel and logical inconsistencies. The grandfather paradox is more than just an intellectual exercise. It touches on fundamental questions about time, causality, and existence. If we could go back and change the past, what would that mean for the present and future? And if we could alter time, would we have the power to shape our destiny? Or would we just be trapped in an endless loop, constantly rewriting history? The grandfather paradox reminds us of the uncertainty surrounding the idea of time travel. In the end, it teaches us that the past is not as malleable as we might hope, and that the nature of time is still one of the great mysteries of the universe.
Grain of millet paradox. Imagine you're sitting quietly in a room, and you're holding a single grain of millet in your hand. You drop the grain on the floor, and it makes a soft sound. It's so small and subtle that it almost goes unnoticed. But as you continue to add more grains, one after the other, eventually you create a pile of millet. At what point does the sound change? When does the collection of millet grains, too small to make a sound individually, become audible enough to be noticed? Is there a specific threshold, a magic number, after which the collective sound of the falling grains suddenly becomes noticeable? This is the essence of the grain of millet paradox, a thought experiment that questions how small incremental changes can accumulate into something significant. At first, the fall of a single grain makes a sound that seems insignificant, but as more and more grains fall, the sound becomes undeniable. Yet, when exactly does it change from silence to sound? In the paradox, the key is perception. If a single grain doesn't make a noticeable sound, then at what point does a small action accumulate to the point where it creates a clear change? This paradox speaks to our understanding of gradual processes and how our minds perceive the shift from insignificant to significant. The grain of millet paradox also draws attention to the continuity of change, how tiny, seemingly unimportant actions or events can gradually add up to something much larger. It's the same idea behind the proverbial drop in the ocean. One drop doesn't make a difference, but many drops together can form an ocean. Take the environmental impact as an example. One person throwing away a piece of plastic might not seem like much, but when you consider billions of people, that single action can lead to massive accumulation. Just like the grains of millet, small actions can build up over time, leading to major changes. In philosophy, the paradox forces us to consider how tiny, seemingly imperceptible changes often lead to larger consequences. We see this in personal growth too. Practicing a skill for just a few minutes every day might not seem like much, but over time, it can lead to mastery. The paradox also speaks to how we view progress. Step by step, it's hard to notice, but eventually, the total impact becomes clear. In physics, the paradox ties into quantum mechanics, where tiny individual particles might seem insignificant, but their collective behavior shapes everything in the universe. In this sense, the paradox reflects how small, seemingly trivial actions or components
can lead to big outcomes that shape the world in ways we don't always see in the moment. This paradox isn't just abstract. It's a reminder that change often happens not in giant leaps, but in tiny, subtle steps. It asks us to reconsider what we think is insignificant and to recognize that sometimes the smallest things can lead to the largest shifts. So the next time you feel like your efforts aren't making an impact, remember the grain of millet paradox. It's not about immediate results, but about recognizing how small changes accumulate over time. And just like those grains of millet, your actions matter, even if they seem too small to notice at first.
Stockdale paradox. Imagine you're in a prisoner of war camp. The conditions are harsh, the food is scarce, and the chances of surviving seem slim. Among the prisoners, there's one man, Admiral James Stockdale, who has endured the most unimaginable torture and isolation. Despite the overwhelming despair around him, he not only survives, but emerges stronger and more resolute than ever. When asked about his survival strategy, Stockdale shares a profound insight. You must maintain unwavering faith that you will prevail in the end and, at the same time, confront the brutal facts of your current reality. This is the essence of the Stockdale paradox, a powerful and unexpected lesson in how to endure life's toughest challenges. It's the delicate balance between optimism and realism. Stockdale realized that blind hope without acknowledging the painful reality leads to disillusionment, while accepting reality without hope results in despair. Here's how the paradox plays out. You must believe with absolute certainty that eventually you will overcome the challenge, survival in Stockdale's case. But you must also acknowledge the brutal, harsh truth of the present moment. The brutal truth in this case is that you may not survive tomorrow, you may be tortured, and hope seems a distant dream. Stockdale's fellow prisoners who clung to unrealistic optimism, saying, "We'll be out by Christmas" or "We'll be out by Easter," ended up dying of a broken heart when those dates came and went. Their blind hope led to devastation. On the other hand, Stockdale's ability to accept the bleakness of his situation while still holding on to hope for eventual victory is what kept them going, and it allowed him to survive. This paradox isn't limited to prisoners of war. It's a universal lesson in how we face adversity in life, whether that's dealing with a health crisis, navigating career challenges, or even personal loss. The Stockdale paradox teaches us that true resilience isn't about avoiding reality, but about embracing it fully, and yet never losing faith in the possibility of success, no matter how distant it may seem. Let's break this down. 1. Faith that you will prevail in the end. This part of the paradox requires you to believe in the possibility of a better outcome, no matter how dire things seem. This is not about wishful thinking, but about maintaining a vision of a future where you succeed, knowing that it might take time and hard work. 2. Confront the brutal facts of your current reality. On the other hand, you must accept the present moment for what it is. You must be honest about your circumstances. Denial doesn't help. If you're in a tough situation, facing difficult truths about the present allows you to find solutions and take necessary actions. This balance of hope and realism is what made Stockdale's strategy work in the most extreme conditions, and it's a strategy that we can apply to everyday life. In practical terms, the Stockdale paradox encourages us to face our challenges head-on, acknowledge our current struggles, but always hold on to the belief that with time, effort, and the right approach, we can come out the other side stronger. It's about not giving up when things get tough, but also not hiding from the truth or letting false hope lead to disillusionment.
By holding these two truths in balance, you can navigate life's hardest moments with strength and resilience. So next time you face a difficult challenge, whether in your personal life or career, remember the Stockdale paradox. Embrace the harshness of the situation, but never lose faith in the possibility of overcoming it. This powerful paradox teaches us that resilience isn't about denying reality, but about adapting to it while still believing in a better future.
Paradox of the raven. Imagine you're standing in a field, gazing up at a raven perched on a nearby tree branch. You observe that the raven is black, and this observation seems perfectly normal. After all, the statement, "all ravens are black," is a simple fact, isn't it? Now, let's twist things a bit. Imagine someone tells you, to prove that all ravens are black, you just need to find evidence that supports the statement. Seems straightforward, right? But then you see a green apple lying on the ground. Is that relevant to the statement, all ravens are black? At first it seems absurd. A green apple has nothing to do with ravens, yet logically, it's connected. According to the rules of formal logic, a green apple is evidence in favor of the statement, all ravens are black, because it supports the contrapositive of the statement. The contrapositive of all ravens are black is if something is not black, it is not a raven. So a green apple, which is not black, proves the contrapositive, meaning it indirectly supports the idea that all ravens are black. This is the paradox of the raven, also known as Hempel's paradox, named after the philosopher Carl Gustav Hempel, who introduced it. On one hand, it seems perfectly reasonable to say that observing black ravens confirms the statement, all ravens are black. But the paradox asks, does observing a green apple also confirm the statement? Logically, it does, but intuitively, it seems completely irrelevant. This paradox is a fascinating challenge to our understanding of evidence. The problem lies in how we evaluate the relevance of evidence. In the case of the raven, we'd likely think that only seeing black ravens would provide meaningful evidence, but logical reasoning tells us that all evidence supporting the contrapositive counts even if it seems completely unrelated. The paradox of the raven challenges our intuitive understanding of what counts as evidence. We often prioritize evidence that directly supports the statement in question, like seeing a black raven. But the paradox shows us that logically, evidence can come from indirect sources. It forces us to question how we define relevance in reasoning and whether all evidence should be treated equally, no matter how trivial or unrelated it may seem. It also raises important questions about scientific reasoning and data interpretation. In the scientific method, we gather evidence to support or disprove hypotheses. But the raven paradox illustrates that evidence is not always straightforward. It can be more complex than we think, and sometimes indirect evidence plays a role, even when it feels disconnected from the hypothesis. In practical terms, the paradox of the raven highlights how we might misinterpret data or overlook key pieces of evidence just because they don't directly support our theory. It teaches us that evidence gathering isn't always as clear-cut as it appears, and that logical reasoning sometimes conflicts with common sense. So, the next time you encounter a situation where evidence seems irrelevant or unconnected to the conclusion, remember the paradox of the raven. It's a reminder that logic and intuition don't always line up, and sometimes the most surprising pieces of evidence can help prove the most obvious truths. Bootstrap paradox. Imagine you've just written a groundbreaking book filled with ideas and innovations that will change the world. You're incredibly proud of it. But then something strange happens. You travel back in time, giving a copy of the book to your younger self. Your younger self, inspired by this book, goes on to write it and eventually publishes it as their own work. Now, the paradox kicks in. Where did the book actually come from? If your younger self wrote the book after you gave it to them and you only received it from your future self, it seems like the book exists without an origin. You didn't write it first, nor did anyone else. It just seems to loop through time with no clear starting point. This is the Bootstrap paradox, a mind-bending concept in time travel that defies our understanding of cause and effect. It's named after the saying, pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, which refers to doing something that seems impossible or creating something that has no clear origin. In this case, the book creates itself, traveling back and forth through time, with no clear creator or origin. The paradox challenges the basic rules of causality, the principle that every effect has a cause. In this case, the cause and the effect are the same thing. The book exists because you gave it to your younger self, and you only have the book because your future self gave it to you. The book's creation becomes a timeless loop with no starting point. This paradox also opens up larger philosophical questions about free will and determinism. If you are the one who creates the book, then you've always created it, right? But what happens if your younger self gets the book and writes it down? Does the act of your younger self writing the book imply you don't have free will because the future already determined your actions? Or does this paradox show that time itself is more fluid than we think, and that the past, present, and future can exist as part of a cyclical loop? It also connects to theories of time travel. The paradox suggests that time doesn't necessarily work in a linear fashion. If time is cyclical, then events could repeat themselves, forming closed loops that create themselves. But here's the catch. The paradox exists because we cannot trace the origin of events. We are left asking, what's the cause and what's the effect? In a broader sense, the Bootstrap paradox is a fascinating way to explore the nature of creation and knowledge. It shows how sometimes ideas or creations don't have clear beginnings. Some things like great works of art or scientific theories might exist as part of a larger, interconnected web of influence, where each idea feeds into the other, looping through time and culture. But what does this paradox really teach us? It invites us to rethink causality and challenge our understanding of origins. It shows us that time, ideas, and even creations might not always follow the rules we expect. Some things might come into existence without a clear beginning. They simply are, existing as part of a larger infinite loop. So, the next time you're faced with a creative idea, remember the Bootstrap paradox. Sometimes ideas don't need a clear origin. They might just exist as part of something larger, woven into the fabric of time and thought, traveling back and forth in ways we can't fully understand. The paradox reminds us that the universe is filled with mysteries that challenge our understanding of time, creation, and the very nature of existence.
Simpson's paradox. Imagine you're in a bustling marketplace, deciding between two treatments for a life-threatening disease. Treatment A and treatment B. You're told by the merchant that treatment A has a higher success rate than treatment B. So you confidently choose A, thinking it's the better option. But then something strange happens. When you break down the data into age groups, for both younger and older patients, treatment B actually performs better. At first, this makes no sense. How can treatment A be better overall when treatment B works better for each group individually? What's going on here? This is the Simpson's paradox at play. A trend that appears in subgroups of data can completely reverse when the data is aggregated. The paradox shows that while treatment A might have a higher success rate overall, treatment B could be more effective for each individual subgroup. Now, let's break this down. The reason for this paradox lies in how the groups are structured. In this case, more younger patients may have chosen treatment A, and they generally have a higher success rate. On the other hand, older patients who tend to have a lower success rate with either treatment may have mostly chosen treatment B. When you aggregate the data, the larger number of younger patients with treatment A skews the overall result in its favor, even though treatment B is more effective within both age groups individually. This paradox isn't just about medical treatments. It's about how we interpret data. It teaches us that aggregated data can hide the true picture. You might think you're getting the whole story, but in fact, the story changes when you look at the finer details. The Simpsons paradox reminds us that data is often far more complex than it first appears. In real life, this paradox has significant implications. It can show up in all kinds of areas: social science, politics, and even business. For example, a study might suggest that one marketing strategy is more successful than another. But when you break the data down by location or demographic, the trend might actually be the opposite. The aggregate data can lead to misleading conclusions unless you dive deeper into the details. Simpson's paradox also challenges our assumptions about causality and correlation. It reminds us that context matters. The data might show one thing, but the real answer lies in how we look at the groups within it. It's a lesson that the whole picture is only truly understood when you examine the pieces, and that sometimes the aggregated data can hide the true complexity. In life, this paradox might appear in social media as well. We often look at someone's popularity and success on platforms like Instagram or Facebook and assume they are universally admired. But look closer and you'll find that their popularity might come from certain groups, such as followers of a specific niche, not from everyone. Ultimately, Simpson's paradox teaches us a vital lesson. Don't trust the numbers at face value. Data can be misleading when viewed from the wrong angle. To get to the truth, we must consider how data is divided and what it's really telling us. So the next time you're faced with a situation that seems to contradict itself, remember Simpson's paradox. The real truth is often hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered by examining things from a different perspective.
Dichotomy paradox. Imagine you're walking across a room, ready to reach the other side. It sounds simple enough, right? But here's the twist. Before you can reach the door, you must first cover half the distance. Then, before you can cover that half, you must cover half of the remaining distance. And then half of that, and so on. At first, this doesn't seem like much of a problem. But here's where the dichotomy paradox kicks in. If you have to keep having the distance, you'll never actually reach the end. You'll always have a smaller distance to cover, but there will always be another half to cover before you reach your destination. The paradox suggests that no matter how far you walk, there will always be another half of the distance to cover before you reach the end. So, how can you ever really reach the door? This paradox, introduced by the ancient philosopher Zeno of Elea, challenges our basic understanding of motion and time. It proposes that to move from one point to another, you must first cover half the distance, then half of that, and so on, creating an infinite series of smaller and smaller steps. But if there are infinitely many steps, how can you ever take the first step, let alone reach your destination? It's a perplexing problem because, in reality, we know that you can indeed reach the other side of the room in just a few seconds. But mathematically, the paradox raises questions about the nature of infinity and continuous processes. Can something infinite, like an infinite number of steps, ever be completed? And if you can't complete an infinite number of steps, how can motion ever occur? So, how do we resolve the dichotomy paradox? The solution lies in understanding infinite series. While it seems like you're constantly having the distance,
the total distance is actually finite. Mathematically, this infinite series converges to a finite number, meaning that even though the steps are infinite, they add up to a finite amount of time and distance. In other words, you can complete an infinite number of steps in a finite time. This resolution of the paradox doesn't change the fact that it challenges our intuition. It shows that our everyday experience of motion, where we expect continuous, smooth progress, actually hides the infinite complexity beneath the surface. The paradox invites us to reconsider how we understand things like distance, time, and motion, suggesting that infinity isn't something that paralyzes us, but rather something that, when understood properly, can be resolved in surprising ways. The dichotomy paradox also connects to modern physics and quantum mechanics. In these fields, we often encounter the concept of infinite divisibility, the idea that space and time can be divided infinitely into smaller parts. Just as Zeno's paradox challenges our understanding of how motion can occur through infinite steps, quantum mechanics forces us to rethink the way we think about space and time on a microscopic level. In a more practical sense, the dichotomy paradox reminds us that not everything can be perfectly divided or understood in absolute terms. Many of the systems we encounter, whether they're physical, mathematical, or even social, don't work in neatly divisible, finite ways. The paradox teaches us that even things that seem infinitely divisible, like time or space, often resolve themselves in a way that we can experience and understand. So, the next time you feel overwhelmed by a process or task that seems to have no end, remember the dichotomy paradox. It's a reminder that even when things seem to go on infinitely, there's often a way to understand and navigate the complexities that seem impossible to overcome. You can always reach your destination, even if the path seems endless.
Barber paradox. Imagine a small town with a single barber. This barber has a peculiar rule. He shaves everyone in the town who does not shave themselves. Now, here's the tricky part. Who shaves the barber? At first glance, this seems like a simple question. Surely the barber must shave himself, right? But according to the rule, he only shaves those who don't shave themselves. So, if the barber shaves himself, he violates the rule, because he's one of those who should not be shaved by anyone else. But if he doesn't shave himself, then he must be shaved by the barber, because he falls into the category of people who do not shave themselves. This creates a paradox. If the barber shaves himself, he contradicts the rule. But if he doesn't, then he must be shaved by the barber. Either way, the situation doesn't hold up, and the barber seems to be trapped in a logical loop. This is the Barber paradox, a famous paradox introduced by Bertrand Russell in the early 20th century to highlight problems in set theory and logic. It's a simple yet profound illustration of what happens when self-reference is involved. The paradox arises from a self-referential problem similar to the liar's paradox. In the liar's paradox, someone says, "This statement is false." If the statement is true, then it must be false. But if it's false, then it must be true. Similarly, in the Barber paradox, the barber's rule refers back to itself in a way that creates a contradiction. The Barber paradox isn't just a quirky brain teaser. It's a fundamental problem in logic. It shows that when a system contains rules that apply to itself, contradictions can arise. This problem of self-reference forces us to think about the limits of formal systems. If we allow rules to refer to themselves, we might end up with contradictions that make it impossible to follow the rules consistently. This paradox also impacts mathematics. In set theory, Russell's paradox revealed a similar issue: the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Does this set contain itself? If it does, then by definition it cannot. If it doesn't, then it must. This paradox forced mathematicians to reconsider the foundations of set theory and to develop new frameworks to avoid self-referential contradictions.
But the Barber paradox isn't just an intellectual exercise. It also has practical implications. In everyday life, self-referential systems appear in many areas. For instance, in programming, recursive functions can sometimes cause infinite loops or contradictions if they're not carefully managed. In legal systems, rules that reference themselves can lead to conflicting interpretations. So, what does the Barber paradox teach us? It shows the dangers of self-referential logic and reminds us that some problems can't be solved within their own framework. When we encounter self-reference, we may need to step outside the system to resolve the contradiction or rethink the way the system is structured. In the end, the Barber paradox isn't more than just a riddle. It's a powerful tool for critical thinking that teaches us to be cautious about assumptions, contradictions, and the way we set up the rules in our systems.
Sword and shield paradox. Imagine you're walking through a medieval marketplace, and a merchant proudly shows you his latest offerings. A sword that can cut through anything, and a shield that is so strong it can block any attack. You look at the items, admiring their craftsmanship, and then the merchant confidently asks, "What happens if the sword strikes the shield?" At first, you might chuckle, thinking it's a simple question. After all, surely one of them must be stronger than the other, right? But as you think more about it, the paradox unfolds. If the sword can cut through anything, then it should be able to pierce the shield, right? But if the shield can block anything, then it should be able to stop the sword, no matter how sharp it is. Now, which one wins? The sword can't cut through the shield because the shield is unbreakable. But the shield can't block the sword because the sword is indestructible. The two items contradict each other, creating an impossible situation where neither can function as intended. This is the sword and shield paradox, also known as the irresistible force paradox or the immovable object paradox. It's a thought experiment that questions the logic of absolute claims. In this case, both the sword's claim to cut through anything and the shield's claim to block any attack are absolute. There's no room for compromise. But when two absolutes collide, they cancel each other out, creating a paradox. The paradox highlights the limitations of absolutes in logic and reasoning. If something is irresistible, it can't be stopped by anything, but if something is immovable, it can't be moved by anything. So what happens when these two opposing absolutes meet? The paradox shows that the world doesn't work with perfect absolutes. The rules of logic break down when we apply them to situations where both sides make unlimited claims. Now, let's dive deeper. The sword and shield paradox isn't just a riddle. It's a metaphor for conflicting principles in real life. Think about freedom and security. The absolute pursuit of freedom can clash with the absolute desire for security. If everyone is free to do whatever they want, security becomes a problem. But if we prioritize security too much, we sacrifice the freedom that is essential for a vibrant society. Much like the sword and shield, these two values, when taken to extremes, can't coexist peacefully. In politics, for example, absolute power can clash with the concept of absolute equality. If one group has too much power, it can undermine the equality of others. The paradox helps us understand that life is rarely about perfect solutions. Instead, it's about navigating conflict and balance. We often have to find compromises that allow different forces to work together, even when those forces seem to be in direct opposition. The sword and shield paradox also touches on the concept of philosophical reasoning. When we apply absolute claims to reality, we run into contradictions that make the system fall apart. For instance, absolute certainty in any form, whether it's about knowledge, politics, or morality, often ignores the nuances and complexities of the world. When we claim that something is irresistible or immovable, we close off any room for flexibility or dialogue. The paradox teaches us that absolutes are rarely practical in real life. In a more practical sense, the paradox can also relate to conflicting goals in our personal lives. Let's say you want to be completely productive while still ensuring you maintain a work-life balance. These two goals, maximizing productivity and preserving balance, can sometimes seem to be in direct conflict, much like the sword and shield. If you focus too much on one, the other is compromised. It's not always about finding the perfect solution, but about managing and balancing conflicting priorities. Ultimately, the sword and shield paradox reminds us that the world is rarely black and white. Extremes, whether they are about power, freedom, knowledge, or productivity, often create situations where nothing works because opposing absolutes can't coexist. The true solution lies in embracing the gray areas and understanding that balance, rather than perfection, is often the key to solving the paradoxes we face in life. So, the next time you encounter a situation where two opposing forces seem to clash with no clear answer, remember the sword and shield paradox. Life isn't about finding perfect absolutes, but about navigating the tension between opposing forces and finding a way to make them work together.
Paradox of lottery. Imagine you've just bought a lottery ticket and the chances of winning are incredibly slim, 1 in 10 million. Yet as you hold the ticket, you feel a certain sense of optimism, convinced that you might just be the lucky winner. This optimism feels perfectly rational because it's your ticket, your chance, right? Now, let's zoom out. In this massive lottery, there are millions of other ticket holders who are also convinced that they might win. In fact, each one of them, just like you, has a sense of personal confidence in their own ticket's chances. Now, here's where things get paradoxical. While the probability of winning for each individual is extremely low, every single person holds the belief that their ticket has a better chance than it logically does. So, what happens when every ticket holder feels that way, even though the odds are stacked against them? This is the paradox of the lottery, a contradiction between the statistical reality and the personal belief of every ticket holder. On an individual level, each person believes that their ticket is somehow special, even though mathematically, their chances of winning are the same as everyone else's. The paradox is this: how can so many people believe they have a better chance when in reality, the odds are the same for everyone? Let's break it down. The paradox occurs because human intuition about probability doesn't always match the actual odds. The ticket holders, despite knowing that the probability of winning is 1 in 10 million, somehow convince themselves that they are the exception. This is a classic case of optimism bias, where we overestimate our chances of success even when faced with overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The paradox of the lottery isn't just about the irrationality of hope. It speaks to something deeper about human nature. It reveals how hope and belief can sometimes distort our perception of probability and lead us to make decisions that don't align with the actual odds. Despite knowing the statistical reality, we cling to the illusion of possibility because it feels good to believe we might win. This paradox also highlights how we perceive risk. We tend to believe that good things will happen to us, even when the evidence shows otherwise. This mindset can play out in many areas of life, not just lotteries, whether it's investing in a risky venture or believing we will always succeed at certain tasks despite the odds. The paradox of the lottery also reflects the tension between probability and perception. Even if the statistical likelihood of an event is tiny, humans are wired to believe in their personal exceptions, the notion that they could somehow beat the odds. So, what can we learn from this paradox? It teaches us about the disconnect between logic and human belief. Despite knowing the numbers, our emotional desire to win big or succeed against the odds clouds our judgment, making us feel like we're the exception to the rule. In a practical sense, this paradox helps us understand how we make decisions based on hope and irrational optimism, even when the logical part of our brain knows better. It's a reminder to recognize how biases and beliefs can affect our thinking, especially when it comes to high-risk situations. The paradox of the lottery challenges our understanding of probability, decision-making, and hope. It forces us to confront the reality that our beliefs don't always align with the facts, and that sometimes the best way to navigate uncertain situations is by acknowledging the odds, no matter how much we might hope for something different. So, the next time you buy a lottery ticket, remember the paradox of the lottery. It's a reminder that while hope and belief are important, we should also be cautious about how we let our optimism influence our decisions, especially when the odds are stacked against us.
Imagine you're standing at the edge of a river, and your child has just been snatched by a crocodile. Your heart races, your breath quickens. The crocodile, with its cold, calculating eyes, looks back at you and says, "I will return your child only if you can correctly guess what I will do next." In this moment, time seems to freeze. Your mind races as you try to think of a solution. The crocodile's words echo in your head. Guess correctly, and your child will be returned. This is the crocodile paradox, a logical trap that confounds your ability to predict or make a correct decision. You're caught in a paradox where both outcomes seem impossible. Here's why. Let's consider your options. 1. You predict that the crocodile will return your child. If the crocodile indeed returns your child, your prediction is correct, and everything works out. Your child is safe, and the crocodile keeps its promise. But if the crocodile doesn't return your child and instead decides to keep them, your prediction becomes wrong, and according to the crocodile's rule, it doesn't have to return the child. 2. You predict that the crocodile will not return your child. If the crocodile decides to keep your child, your prediction is correct. But then, by the crocodile's own rule, it must return your child because you guessed correctly. This creates a contradiction, because the crocodile cannot simultaneously keep and return the child. No matter which way you turn, logical consistency breaks down. The crocodile is trapped in a paradox of its own making, and so are you. This paradox is an example of a self-referential paradox, where a statement or rule refers to itself in a way that makes it impossible to resolve logically. The crocodile paradox is reminiscent of the famous liar's paradox, where someone says, "This statement is false." If the statement is true, it must be false. But if it's false, it must be true, creating an endless loop of contradiction. But the crocodile paradox is more than just a quirky puzzle. It's a reflection on the nature of promises, truth, and trust. If a promise is made in such a way that it can't be logically kept, can it truly be called a promise? And in a situation built on contradictions, is there ever a truly just or fair outcome? At a deeper level, this paradox also sheds light on power and control. The crocodile isn't just an innocent bystander in this logic game. It creates the trap. By setting up a rule that ensures a logical contradiction, the crocodile controls the situation no matter what you predict. This mirrors real-world systems of authority, where rules are often designed in such a way that they ensure control, even when they seem unfair or contradictory. Philosophers have long debated whether this paradox can be resolved. Some argue that the crocodile paradox isn't about finding an answer at all. It's about understanding that not every question has a clear resolution. The paradox reveals the limitations of language and logic and how our assumptions about fairness and promises can be flawed. So what's the real lesson here? The crocodile paradox teaches us that not everything in life can be neatly solved through reasoning. Some situations, whether in philosophy, legal contracts, or everyday life, are so inherently contradictory that no answer can satisfy both sides. If you ever find yourself facing a situation that seems impossible to resolve, where every option leads to a contradiction, remember the crocodile paradox. Sometimes the game is rigged from the start, and the only way out is to recognize the paradox for what it is: a cleverly constructed trap hiding behind the illusion of choice.
Imagine a society that prides itself on its open-mindedness, tolerance, and acceptance of diverse beliefs, backgrounds, and cultures. In this society, everyone is free to express their thoughts, engage in conversation, and live according to their personal values. The principle of tolerance is held up as one of the highest virtues, ensuring that all people, regardless of their differences, can coexist peacefully and harmoniously. But then, something troubling begins to emerge. A new ideology starts to take root, one that opposes the very idea of tolerance. It is an ideology that seeks to suppress others, to undermine the freedoms that the society cherishes. And here's the catch. This ideology is being tolerated by the very society that values openness and freedom. At this moment, a profound and unsettling question arises. Can a tolerant society remain tolerant if it tolerates intolerance? This question is the heart of the tolerance paradox, a deeply philosophical dilemma that forces us to confront the very limits of tolerance itself. The tolerance paradox isn't just about political ideologies, nor is it confined to abstract thought experiments. It's a real-world challenge that lies at the core of democratic values, human rights, and the principles of freedom. If a society tolerates all views, should it also tolerate those that aim to destroy tolerance? Does the very acceptance of such views contradict the foundational belief in freedom and equality? This paradox raises questions not only about justice, but about how societies define and enforce boundaries. Let's break down the paradox into a few key scenarios to better understand the tension. Imagine a society that allows a group to advocate for the suppression of rights, perhaps a movement that calls for restricting freedom of speech or undermining equality for minorities. If this society allows this group to express its views openly, it seems that it is doing what it has always done, tolerating differing opinions. But this tolerance begins to unravel when we consider the long-term consequences of permitting views that attack the very essence of tolerance. If the intolerant group gains traction and starts to suppress the rights of others, it creates a fundamental contradiction. By tolerating the intolerant, the tolerant society risks losing the very freedoms that it claims to uphold. This becomes a catch-22. In order to protect tolerance, the society must refuse to tolerate intolerance. Yet, by doing so, it seems to be violating its own principle of tolerance. How can we reconcile this? Philosopher Karl Popper first articulated this dilemma in his influential work, The Open Society and Its Enemies, 1945. Popper argued that a society must reserve the right to be intolerant toward intolerance itself. He acknowledged that this stance might seem paradoxical. How can a society founded on tolerance justify intolerance? Yet, Popper's view challenges us to see tolerance not as an absolute, unqualified good, but as a principle that must sometimes be actively defended. Let's think about this with a real-world example: freedom of speech. The First Amendment in the United States guarantees the right to free speech for all citizens, no matter their beliefs. But what happens if a group advocates for violent actions against others? Should they be allowed to speak freely in the name of tolerance? The question isn't whether we should allow differing opinions, but whether those opinions threaten the very structure of democracy and freedom. In this case, the tolerance paradox asks whether absolute tolerance might inadvertently create conditions for intolerance to thrive. To deepen our understanding, we can explore the philosophical implications of what tolerance truly means. Tolerance, by definition, is not the same as acceptance. To tolerate something means to allow it to exist, to coexist peacefully despite disagreement. But what happens when the beliefs or actions of one group begin to directly harm another group? How much tolerance can a society extend without undermining its own moral and ethical foundations? This paradox has a profound implication for moral philosophy. Is tolerance a universal good, or is it context-dependent? Does it have limits? The key to resolving this paradox may lie in distinguishing between harmful ideologies and healthy disagreements. It's one thing to tolerate criticism and debate. These are vital elements of a thriving open society. It's another to tolerate ideas that actively seek to oppress, discriminate, or deny others their rights. The former is an invitation to dialogue. The latter is a threat to peace. The paradox also leads us into the realm of political philosophy. In the modern world, democracies often struggle with the question of how to deal with extremist views. Should we continue to protect the rights of individuals who seek to dismantle the system of freedom? How do we prevent harmful ideologies from spreading while still protecting the right to free expression? This challenge is particularly urgent today as political polarization, misinformation, and extremist movements rise around the globe. Practical consequences of the tolerance paradox are seen in political systems. Take, for example, the rise of far-right groups in many democracies. These groups often use the very freedoms guaranteed by the system to push for policies that would limit those freedoms for others. Should they be allowed to use these freedoms to advocate for their cause, or should the system draw a line when their speech turns to hate? The tolerance paradox requires societies to grapple with the reality that certain beliefs, when acted upon, may erode the freedoms that allow all citizens to coexist peacefully. Interestingly, the tolerance paradox doesn't only apply to political systems, it has relevance in everyday social dynamics. In interpersonal relationships, we often encounter moments where tolerance becomes a question of personal boundaries. When is it appropriate to tolerate a friend's differing beliefs, and when does their intolerance cross a line that should not be tolerated? In these personal encounters, the paradox challenges us to find balance between acceptance and self-protection. So can this paradox be solved? While philosophers have spent centuries debating the resolution of this issue, the general consensus is that there is no simple answer. The tolerant society must remain vigilant, constantly evaluating the extent to which it is willing to accept views that may ultimately undermine the values of freedom, equality, and human dignity. Some propose restrictions on speech or legal boundaries as a solution, allowing tolerance only as long as it doesn't harm others. Others argue for a more dynamic approach to tolerance, one that continually evolves as society changes. But perhaps the most profound lesson of the tolerance paradox is this: tolerance isn't an unqualified virtue, nor is it a passive act. It requires active defense, discerning limits, and the willingness to protect the very values that make tolerance possible. We must understand that true tolerance is not about endless acceptance, but about finding ways to navigate difference without sacrificing our fundamental principles. In the end, the tolerance paradox teaches us a valuable and difficult truth. Sometimes the most tolerant thing we can do is to be intolerant toward intolerance. Recognizing this paradox, understanding its complexities, and seeking the balance between freedom and safety is what ensures that a society remains truly open and free without unraveling its own foundation.